Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And moving right along, we go into Spine 58, Peeping Tom, directed by Michael Powell, 1960. This is another out-of-print title, but this one was more recent. This is another title that was licensed by Studio Canal. And before I get into the film, I'll get into a little bit about the whole out-of-print status and what that means. For fans of the Criterion Collection, the three dreaded letters that you'll see is OOP, out of print. And the reason being is that the way that Criterion is able to release what it's able to release, it's all done by permission. And it's whatever studio or whoever owns the rights to distribute it, that they are granted permission to release it in their way. And some studios are more protective of their property than others. In the early days of Criterion DVD releases, the main culprit for putting titles out of print was MGM, because when they first were issuing Laserdiscs, license to issue Laserdiscs were much easier to obtain because it was more of a specialty home video market. Not a lot of people had Laserdiscs back then, and so it was something where, unlike with VHS, it was like, oh, Laserdisc, all right, that's fine. And this is why when you look at there is a list of Criterion Laserdiscs, and you see a lot more titles on Laserdisc than you do on DVD. Of course, now it's surpassed that as far as number, but as far as the type of titles, I mean, you had 2001 was a Criterion Laserdisc. Blade Runner was a Criterion Laserdisc. Akira was a Criterion Laserdisc. A lot of Woody Allen's, both Annie Hall and Manhattan, were Criterion Laserdisc. Raging Bull. And so, but then when DVDs first came out, the idea was to try to port as much over as possible from that to DVDs. And some of the initial DVDs were that. But then, when DVDs were proven to be a very viable home video format, the studios were more protective, and this included MGM. They wanted to do their own DVD releases, and so that's why there were a lot of titles that quickly went out of print in the early days. This includes The Silence of the Lambs, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, This is Spinal Tap, and RoboCop, to name a few. And of course, the interesting thing is that when MGM did put out their DVDs, it ended up being, I think worse than the initial Criterion releases. But now, with in the start of the 2010s, the studio that caused a lot of titles to go out of print suddenly was Studio Canal, whereas they were initially they were happy to license it out to Criterion, but since they started their own, they wanted to get into Blu-ray, and they used that as an opportunity to issue it on Blu-ray. So in the process, it caused a lot of Criterion titles to go out of print, and Peeping Tom was one of them. In fact, I had to. When there was a slew of titles that went out of print because of Studio Canal, I had to look at what I wanted and prioritize what I wanted to get right away, because I knew I would never get a chance. I was holding off. Usually with purchases, I try to be methodical about it and take my time with it and really see that this is something worth getting, especially with the earlier releases. And I think I was holding off on Peeping Tom. Peeping Tom was a title that I wanted for a long time, and I think I was holding it off for maybe that there was going to be a reissue down the line. But since it was going to go out of print, it's like, okay, that answers my question. Let's get this title right away. And actually, it looks quite nice. I mean, I don't know what would have happened with the reissue. I mean, certainly would have been available on Blu-ray, and maybe it would have been a chance to reevaluate the transfer. But I think it's really the best you're going to do with that. So, as far as the Criterion side of things. But anyways, Peeping Tom. I actually first saw this title in a seminar course that I took when I was at William & Mary. It was called Philosophy in Film. And this was one of the titles that we saw. And this is a film that has a very interesting history. This was a Michael Powell directed film. We've talked about him before with The Red Shoes, and so this happened after. This is after the dissolvement of the Archers, the company, essentially the company that was Powell Pressburger. It was an amicable dissolve. They actually remained good friends long after that, but it was just, I think they just both felt that it's run its course, they've done everything that they needed to do, and it's just time to move on. So it was a very amicable split. There was no drama whatsoever. Didn't stop Pressburger from doing the kind of films that he wanted to do, and it certainly didn't stop Michael Powell from doing the films that he kind of wanted. This film did put an end to his career in the United Kingdom. When it came out, it was noted for its vicious critic response. I mean, the critics hated the film. Probably one of the more famous responses was that this is a film that should be it should not be in a theater. It should be in the toilet, and all the critics of and all the British critics should be holding the flush handle to flush it down. It was that strong. And then the story goes is that it started to have kind of a cult appeal. It was another favorite film of Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, and they were able to help restore some dignity to it, and now it's considered a masterpiece in both thriller and the horror genre. So why is that? why this big turnaround? Well, I think what caused it was it was the nature of the film itself. The film looks at a serial killer who murders women while he has this 16 millimeter Bell and Howell camera that he has, and he uses that to record that moment of terror when they're about to die. And there's a little bit more to that. I'll try to keep, this is one where I'll try to keep the spoilers to a minimum or keep it very mild, but that's really what this is about. And what's been pondered after the backlash, the initial backlash that came in 1960, was that the way that the film was constructed, it drew attention to the fact that cinema is a very voyeuristic medium. And it makes sense, because what you're doing to yourself is you're looking, and this is a paraphrase of Roger Ebert, by the way. You are looking into other people's lives. That is what you do when you see a film. You're looking at someone else's lives. And it goes on to say that most films are well behaved in pointing this out. This one is very unapologetic in pointing out that you are a voyeur. You are the act of watching is a voyeuristic tendency. It makes you a culprit. And there have been other films that have explored this tendency. Another one they're going to eventually do down the road, Man Bites Dog, is another one where it looks at the voyeuristic tendencies of cinema. Now, is this necessarily a bad thing? I mean, when you describe something as voyeuristic, it automatically labels cinema as this bad, vile, evil thing. But I don't think that it's necessarily. It doesn't have to be a moral issue. But it is I will say that it is a characteristic of cinema, and I think this and Peeping Tom dared to say that, and I think that was part of the reason why there's this strong backlash. But I also think that there was more to it than that. I think the other big thing was this was a director that was known for creating great films. I mean, this is the same guy that did The Red Shoes, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, I Know Where I'm Going, A Canterbury Tale, The 49th Parallel, and Black Narcissist. You know, just these great films for the British industry. And this was a film that was unlike the stuff that he had done previously. And boy, I'm getting major lens flare here. Hi, J.J. Abrams. Anyways, and congratulations. But I digress. But this was a film, when you look at it, it looks like a B horror film. And it was almost like, how dare he stoop himself to that low of making a what seemingly B grade product. The film stock was, I think it was Eastman, not Technicolor, so it looked really, really cheap, and it kind of bordered on sleaze a bit. It had one of the earliest instances of nudity in a film. Of course, it had to be severely cut. There was actually more that was actually shot, but it was never part of the final film, just due to censor cuts, and it was just really, really. Actually, I think it's cool that there's a flare onto it. It fits the subject matter quite well. Not intentional, but that's a nice little bonus. But anyways, so it's this seemingly cheap looking B grade horror film, and the critics are like, what is this guy doing to himself? He's making ostensibly a kind of exploitation film before exploitation films became a thing, and he's making us feel uncomfortable by pointing out that, you know, you are a voyeur, you are the Peeping Tom is you, the idiot is you, and they felt very insulted by all of this. It was an insult to their intelligence, if you will, and that's where you get the strong backlash against it. And I think it took a lot of people who weren't critics and also could see and appreciate the art of filmmaking to see that what this was about, and that's where the vindication comes in. There was something that Martin Scorsese said that I just found that I really like. What he said. He called this film and 8.5. Fellini's 8.5. Are the two films that says everything that you need to know about directing. And he goes on to say, I've always felt that Peeping Tom and 8.5 say everything that can be said about filmmaking, about the process of dealing with film, the objectivity and subjectivity of it, and the confusion between the two. 8.5 captures the glamour and enjoyment of filmmaking, while Peeping Tom shows the aggression of it, how the camera violates. From studying them, you can discover everything about people who make films, or at least people who express themselves through films. And yeah, Peeping Tom is, and this gets into another thing. Peeping Tom came about at around the time when psychoanalytical films were becoming a big thing, where psychoanalysis was becoming more and more of an element in films. This would be the same year that Psycho would come out. And in fact, when Hitch was about to show it in the UK, he did not have a press screening for it. because he had seen what happened to Michael Powell with Peeping Tom. And so he avoided the whole thing and just did not issue a press screening. But with both films, you have a character who is very disturbed, but ultimately very sympathetic. You really sympathize with Mark Lewis, played by Karl-Heinz Boom, which you wonder, why is somebody who is German playing an Englishman? But Michael Powell wanted him, and what's good enough for him, it'll be good enough for me. or you have no choice. And part of what makes him disturbed is first off, his father was Mark identifies him as a scientist, but I think he was more of a behavioral psychologist, and his primary interest was in fear, and he obsessively recorded everything involving fear, and he inadvertently used his son as a guinea pig. And this aspect really, I think, definitely had a profound effect on him and led him to do what. So he sees these murders as a continuation of his father's work of recording the terror, and so that's what he does. It's still very vile, but you also there is a sympathy that's elicited, and maybe that's another thing that people, I think the British critics didn't like initially. It's a character doing vile things, and he actually looks handsome. You know, he's not this decrepit little monster thing. But how dare they? But you know, now it's become more the norm. We have sympathetic antagonists or sympathetic villains, but at that time it was I don't want to say unheard of, but it was certainly quite a shock to see. But there's that. There's also in the film some nice little jabs at the British film industry at the time. There was a film within the film. Mark Lewis, in addition to this little hobby of his, he also works as a focus puller presumably in Pinewood Studios. And he's involved in this sort of very trite commercial affair, and it's a nice little commentary on that. He also works as a photographer for pinup girls, for dirty pictures. And so again, it's just all this sleaziness that's just there on screen, and no wonder the British critics just hated the film at the time. Oh yeah, and here's the other kicker: the father is played by Michael Powell, which gives you all that presents itself with all kinds of meta commentary. And in fact, the young Mark Lewis is played by his son Columba, and there's a moment where there's a point where Mark what sort of tries to redeem him or change him is meeting his fellow tenant, Vivian. I'm sorry. That's who Maura Schreier plays. But Helen, there we go. Helen Stevens, played by Anna Massey, and this was her screen debut. She had been in theater before, but anyways, but she represents a kind of innocence and sort of encourages him in her own way to get out of his shell, and she kind of provides the means of maybe helping him get out of this. And she's also redheaded, which proves my point that Michael Powell loves redheads. I mentioned Maura Schreier earlier. She was in The Red Shoes, but she's in this as well, and also doing some dancing there too. But at any rate, so yeah, redheads. Good grief. Anyways, so she in a way, like going back to Psycho, I kind of see her as being the equivalent of Marion Crane in relation to Norman Bates, the way that Helen relates to Mark Lewis, in the sense that she can provide a kind of escape or some perspective and a way of kind of reevaluating his life. The only difference is that, okay, mild spoilers, she does not get murdered. No harm comes to her, so she does not end up dead in the shower, and makes people not want to take a bath or shower, so go to the dry cleaners. Anyways, by the way, if you can't see me throughout this, I really, really apologize for this, but I think I'm going to keep this because, again, the seedy subject matter, I think, kind of helps a little bit, gives it the right effect. But so anyway, I apologize for that. I try to be more careful about when I do these episodes, when I actually film these episodes, so that the sun doesn't get in the way. But anyway, I would say that it is definitely a film worth watching. If you like, basically if you like horror and thriller, it's definitely good. But I especially would recommend it for anyone who wants to look at the nature of film itself, wants to go into the metaphysics of film, and this is definitely a film that stimulates that kind of debate. One of the famous positive criticisms that were made in regards to the film is actually can be found in its commentary track provided by Laura Mulvey, who talks about the cinema as being a masculine art form, and the eternal gaze, for instance, that the camera itself is a very masculine thing, and that voyeurism is, so it gets into feminist territory, which in a way it's kind of interesting, but obviously it's not. It should be just like the only way of viewing it. Anyway, so yeah, it's a way of kind of exploring the nature of filmmaking, and again, I want to say that just because it has a voyeuristic tendency does not make it good or evil. And in fact, I think that's kind of the point of this, is that cinema is naturally voyeuristic, but it's always to what end? Are you looking at somebody's life because you want to? What's the desire? What's the end? I like to say that for many people, cinema is a way of looking into someone's life in order to know something about ourselves. And especially if a film is honest with yourself, you can then ask yourself, okay, do I want to keep this going, or do I want to do something different? Do I want to change, or just remain the same? And that, I think, is cinema. That's why I feel that cinema in the end, has a positive value, even if it has tendencies that you can construe as being negative, a voyeurism. If you believe that one's life is one's own life, and that there's a sense of privacy and space that should be respected, cinema does violate that space. And this is something that actually several directors have commented on this. Orson Welles has famously stated that there's two things that should never be filmed. One is the act of making love, and the other is praying to God. He considers those to be very personal, intimate moments, and that should not be filmed. Krzysztof Kieslowski has talked about this voyeuristic tendency. In fact, that's because of this. It made him not want to do documentaries. He started off doing documentaries, but then when he really noticed the voyeuristic tendencies of it, he felt that should be left alone, and so he went off into a different direction, and actually for the best. So I think, again, this was a film that acknowledged that and was really in your face with this. And this is I think one of the reasons why there was such a strong backlash from the British critics. And I think after that, I think some time had passed, and certainly some other filmmakers were coming into it, not from a critic viewpoint, but just as filmmakers. They see it for what they could see that this is a well-made film that says something meaningful and profound in regards to film, and it should be celebrated as such. And for that, the film was vindicated, and eventually Michael Powell was vindicated as well, and was able to spend the last remaining years of his life not in embarrassment. I mean, he didn't. I think he made like a few films after that, but certainly not in the UK. He made those in Australia. He moved to Australia after the whole thing. But so yeah, I definitely would. I mean, unfortunately, it is out of print, so it may be really hard to come by. But I would say that if you can track a copy and at least try to watch it. But I would definitely recommend it for those who are interested in exploring the nature or the essence or the metaphysics of film, but all done within the conventions of horror and thriller, and particularly psychological thriller. So if you're a fan of those kinds of films, or if you want to explore film in that way, it has my recommendation on those grounds. So that's Peeping Tom. Excuse me. And until next time, take care.